Well, good afternoon and welcome. It's great to be here and great to see you all out in the afternoon sun here in Adelaide at Adelaide Writers' Week. I hope the festival has been a treat for you all, as it has been for my good self. I'm Paul Barclay from Radio National's Big Ideas program. I'm recording this session for my program. Before I go any further, let me acknowledge that this land that we meet on today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people. We respect their spiritual relationship with the country, and we also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to living Kaurna people today. All of us here today, myself included, condemn racism in its many manifestations. We may have marched under the Black Lives Matter banner in support of Indigenous rights and reconciliation, thrown our weight behind the apology, the Uluru Statement, and the need for a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice. But what if, despite this, it's white people like me and you who are the problem, and that we're in denial? What if the most harm to Black, Indigenous and other racialised people is not caused by white supremacists and white nationalists, as insidious as they are, but by white left-leaning progressives, the type of people who might attend writers' festivals and listen to Radio National, my radio station, and view themselves as anything but racist? This contention is the basis for Robin DiAngelo's book, Nice Racism: How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. It may be an uncomfortable proposition to some of you, but Robin doesn't spare herself in this regard, writing that she too continues to struggle with stubborn and deeply internalised racist patterns. Nice Racism follows on from Robin's best-selling book, White Fragility, a term she coined in 2011 that later went viral. Robin is an American academic, lecturer, anti-racist campaigner and educator, and an author working in the fields of critical discourse analysis and whiteness studies. Would you please give a warm Adelaide welcome? Hello, Robin, and happy International Women's Day. I'm having trouble hearing you. I'll fire this question at you and hopefully that'll be okay. So, Robin, when white people, white progressives, think of racism, I guess many think of overt racial abuse and maybe hate crimes. But what is nice racism?
Continuum, right? And let's start with, if we accept the premise that racism is systemic, that it is built into the foundation of our cultures at this point. System. There's no neutral place in a society in which systemic racism is the default. So to be passive, to ever think I'm not part of the problem, I'm fine, is to uphold that system.
Give us some examples, if you will, of the type of behaviours that you're talking about. It might be helpful for those of us perhaps to recognise those behaviours in ourselves.
Oh, certainly. And I do see there's a little lag between when you ask me and when I respond. So I think at this point, we're all going to be very gracious and patient with the technology.
Indeed.
There is a pattern that I call credentialing, and that is all of the evidence that white people will offer up to establish something that is very important for us to establish, and that is that we're not racist. So we offer up this evidence to establish that. Unfortunately, it's not particularly convincing. Anyone who understands the systemic nature of racism isn't convinced by that evidence. People of color, which is the language that I'm used to using here, they're rolling their eyes. And what we're telling them is that, one, we don't really understand the systemic nature of racism. Two, we're not particularly self-aware. And three, we're probably going to be a little bit defensive if they try to challenge our self-image. So we say things like this. And notice how much of this evidence is based on some form of proximity. I had a Black roommate in college. I work in a very diverse environment. I've traveled around the world. I was on a mission in Africa, right? We will call up the different interactions we've had across race. And it's actually really useful to use that and ask yourself, okay, if this is the person's evidence that they are free of racism, then what definition of racism does this rest on, right? In order for proximity to say, I can't be racist, that must mean that a racist can't stand proximity. And right here, we can see that's pretty thin evidence, because I can assure you that even white nationalists can tolerate proximity. Places we're from, right? Hey, racism's an American problem. We don't have that here. I'm hoping that Australians are not in denial. Our histories might be different. Some of the cultural nuances might be different, but by every measure, the outcomes are the same.
In the beginning of
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to quote an example that you give in the beginning of your book that I think is a helpful illustration. You tell this story about when earlier in your life, I think you're in your early 30s, you go out to dinner with people you've never met before, and when you arrive, you discover that they are Black. You don't really know, you write in the book, that many Black people at this stage in your life, but you're excited to meet them. Tell us what happened next.
Yeah, I was very excited. I saw, these people are Black. And I felt an immediate urge, really a sense of urgency to immediately telegraph to them that I wasn't racist. So how did I go about doing that? I regaled them all night long with every example of racism I could think of that my family had ever engaged in. I told them all the jokes. I told them all the, terrible, prejudicial things, the ignorant things they had said. And in my mind, it was like, see, I know that's racist, so therefore I'm not racist like they are. What, of course, I was actually doing was subjecting them to racism all night long. And unfortunately, at that time in my awareness, had they challenged me, I mean, think about how miserable a dinner that must have been for those people and the position they were in, right? I mean, they could endure it and have a miserable evening and take that home with them, right? And, that's not going to disappear as soon as the dinner's over. So there's that ongoing stress. It's part of the 1,000 daily cuts. It's not in isolation that I behave that way. They could have challenged me And I'm very sorry to say that had they, I would not have responded well. I would have responded with white fragility. I would have felt unfairly accused and attacked. And so that would have been a whole nother, burden for them to bear. I look back now and I can see all of that. And so at the opening, when you were summarizing the book, and I also said, I'm not going to be free in my lifetime, but I do believe we can do less harm. But less harm isn't just niceness or smiling, right? Less harm is critical awareness. It's self-awareness. It's receptivity to feedback in moments like that. It's recognizing that it's ongoing work and that you don't arrive and you're finished. And far too many white people think it's not me, it's them. And so I need to tell them. The number one question I get when I do give a talk is, well, how do I tell my friend or coworker about their racism? And I like to look at the person right in the eyes and pause and say, well, how would I tell you about yours? Because the question assumes that it's not me. It's going to be somebody else. And so we tend to be very defensive. And the more important it is to our identities to be seen as not racist, the more defensive we actually are.
I mean, we are defensive because it is a terrible thing to think of yourself as racist, right? That's why we feel defensive. Does this mean, because we don't want to think of ourselves in that way, that we resist subjecting ourselves to the type of self-examination that may make us more critical of our relationships with black people and people of colour?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that most white people live segregated lives, and we're not educated in any consistent way. And yet we're continually given the message that it's natural for us to live separate and to have what we have, and that we have it because we deserve it and so forth. And so we tend to be rather arrogant in our ignorance, and we lack that humility. I often say, if Neil deGrasse Tyson says something challenging about the way I understand the cosmos, I'm going to assume that I'm missing something. And want to learn more. But when it comes to racism, we tend to think everybody's opinion is equal to everybody else's, and so we lack that humility. But we're part of the problem. I think a foundational part of the problem is what we're taught to understand racism is. So most people have been taught to think about it as individual, conscious dislike, and intentional meanness. In other words, intentionally wanting to be mean to somebody because we don't like them based on their race. And if that's your definition, then if I say what I'm saying right now, you're going to hear me saying you're an immoral person. I mean, you're a bad person. You don't like people based on nothing that's fair, and you seek to be mean to them. And I'm with you for being offended if that's what you think I'm saying. But that isn't. We have to understand the systemic nature of racism, and then we know it's an inevitable outcome. And so we can change the question from if I've been shaped by the forces that surround me to how have I been shaped? And those questions are so fundamentally different in the kinds of behaviors and responses that they engender.
So I've always said that I have no idea what it is like to experience racism because I am white and I'm middle class and privileged. You are white as well. What can a white person teach another white person about racism if they've never experienced it personally?
Yeah, well, I mean, even that thing, we have experienced it personally, but on the benefiting end of it. So there's also this sense that and a part of it is the way that mainstream culture talks about racism. Generally, if we're going to get educated, we expect that Black or Indigenous peoples are going to come and teach us about their experience. We don't expect that we're going to be asked about what it means to be white, right? And so we separate ourselves from the examination when in fact it's a relationship between groups. Indigenous peoples cannot be oppressed if somebody isn't oppressing, and they can't be disadvantaged if somebody isn't advantaged. So we actually do experience racism in a sense, in that sense. Okay. And as insiders, there is a piece of it. So let me back up and say we won't understand or learn without listening to peoples of color. Absolutely. But we can't only listen to them. And for any people listening right now who identify as women and who acknowledge the existence of patriarchy, yes, men have to listen to women, but there's a way in which men understand patriarchy that I just can't. Right? They have a piece of it that's different than the piece I have. And when they talk to each other about it, they can hear each other a little better. And it's harder to dismiss a fellow man when he's saying, let's get real, guys. We know this is going on.
Yeah.
And we know we do this, and this is how we do this. And we might not want to say this in front of women, but let's get real. So there are many pieces of this that white people can and should be doing with each other. In a lot of ways, what we tend to do in our enthusiasm is somewhat like what I did at the dinner. Let's throw everybody in a room and just start talking about racism. And when you do that and you have white people who haven't thought deeply, who see themselves as outside the problem, who define racism as intentional acts of meanness, those discussions end up being very harmful. We say and do things. Look at what I did at the dinner. We say and do things that are really hurtful. So a part of this work is we have to get together separate and get ourselves in a little bit better shape. Express our defensiveness there, work with each other to get through it, and then come together and have those conversations where we're going to be a little more receptive and have a little more humility in the dialogue.
You conduct workshops on this, and many of the examples in your book come from the workshops that you've conducted over the years. How do progressive white people, self-professed anti-racists, if you like, respond to the types of things that you're saying now when you put it to them that they invariably have been acting in their interactions with people of colour in a racist way? What's their first response when this is pointed out to them?
Well, the way they react today versus when I was starting 20 years ago, I'm so much better and more effective. And, right now we're having a dialogue, and it'll be interesting to see how the things I'm saying are landing when we open it. But I do have the benefit of a presentation most of the time where I can scaffold this, where I can kind of go step by step by step. I use a lot of images. I use a lot of examples. And at this point, I'm pretty effective, and most people are with me. There are people who are going to find a less direct approach more effective. There's no one way to get something so charged and so sensitive to get that right by everybody.
Yeah.
There's just no way. So, engage in every possible angle and approach that you can, and then, put all of that together. We need many, many avenues in.
Do people storm out of your training courses outraged? And
I did just see. I'm laughing because I did just see somebody stand up, and I did wonder if they were going to the restroom or whether they were offended or whether they had something else to do. Not so much anymore. It actually has been a long time since somebody has gotten up and said something and stormed out. Yeah, but if you're watching what's going on in the U.S. It's manifesting in different ways, which is there are states and municipalities in the US, where it is literally illegal to teach about racism.
Yeah.
It would be illegal for you to have done that a land acknowledgement. They literally, you cannot talk about race. That is white fragility on steroids. And it's also a great example of what it means to say one group's experience and perspective backed with legal authority and institutional control. People of color aren't in position to outlaw white people making them uncomfortable. I mean, can you even imagine? But the governor of Florida just signed a bill that says you can't make white people uncomfortable about race. Right. And that's why I reserve the term racism to talk about white people's bias. I don't use racism to talk about people of color's bias. In other words, I don't say everybody's racist. I say everybody is biased. They're just as racially biased as we are. But systemic racism is what happens when you back my group's bias with legal authority and institutional control. That's what transforms it into the system.
Yeah.
Right.
So I suppose the bottom line for someone like me and other privileged white progressives is that our life is unlikely to be materially affected if we remain in denial about the nice racism that you say we are exhibiting. So I wonder then if there is a risk in saying that all white people are causing racial harm. Might these white people just think, oh, it's all too hard, and give up and not engage, and still have a perfectly good life, but nothing really has much been achieved as a result?
Yeah, I mean, that is a choice we have. That's the reality. We have that choice, and many of us will make it and do make it. The status quo, the comfort of it, the benefits of it are highly seductive. And on some level, there really are no consequences for us to make that choice. And there are consequences when we choose to break with white solidarity, break silence, have difficult conversations, help each other see these things. And so on one level, it kind of comes down to who do you want to be in the world? Do you really want to align what you profess to value with your actual behavior? And this is why Ibram X. Kendi, he wrote a best-selling New York Times book too called How to Be an Anti-Racist. He says the opposite of racist isn't not racist. The opposite of racist is anti-racist. Because not racist is passive within a society in which racism is the default, and anti-racist is active. But, you know, I can make a case, and since this is a book fair, if you will, Heather McGhee has a new book called The Sum of Us. And that entire book makes the case that we all do lose, that it takes incredible resources to maintain the kind of segregation that we maintain. It doesn't happen naturally. It's the result of decades of policies and practices. I'm sure you have some background in those in your context. It takes incredible resources and social services, and you know, in the U.S. to warehouse, you know, millions of Black people in our prison system, and you know, to have unequal education. We pay a price for that.
Yeah. And just to be clear, your book is dealing with the United States where you are from, but the framing of your book is equally applicable to a country like Australia and the type of racism that white progressives here are practicing, would you say?
Yes, I have been to Australia. I had the pleasure. Oh, how I wish I could be there right now. I was invited.
We wish you were here as well.
Thank you. I was invited by the University of Sydney. So often when I'm invited somewhere outside of the U.S., the white people pull me aside and say, we just want you to know we don't have this problem here. And then the people of color pull me aside. They're the ones that brought me, usually, and say, please, dear Lord, help us with these white people. So in some ways, what I did notice is that you have been engaged not as long in this conversation in the way that we have in the US. So the white fragility or the defensiveness can actually be greater in the Australian context. But under the chapter that has common patterns, I named credentialing as a common pattern. Another one is what I call it's different where I come from.
Yeah.
And you don't know it here, and you're not from here, and so you don't know how it's different. And here's what I would say. On the one level, sure, it's different where you come from. So since I can tell you that the outcomes are going to be the same, across every measure, across every institution, you're going to see racial inequality. I don't think Australian people, white people, would deny that. How we would explain that might vary, but that it's the reality is clear. And so given that outcome's the same, then it's on you to translate this. Okay, what does this look like in my context?
Yep.
But it's not helpful for you to dismiss it out of hand. And this is part of the work. It takes some effort. You're going to have to educate yourself. If the thought leaders in this field, for example, are using the term white supremacy, and you think that's a really harsh term and a terrible term, and you don't understand why they're using it, then rather than ask us not to use it, see it as, well, I need to get up to speed because I must be missing something. They're using this with comfort, and they're talking about something that's different than what I think this is about. And so again, we're back to the humility that I necessarily am missing something, because this is arguably the most complex, nuanced socio-political dynamic of the last several hundred years.
Yeah.
There aren't simple answers like, let's pretend that we don't see color.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, again, that continual humility.
Yes. I think the concept of white fragility is a newer concept to Australia than it is in the United States, notwithstanding the fact that your book is very popular here as well. But this is the idea that when a black person or a person of colour calls out racist behaviour, even unconscious behaviour, white people will sometimes become so affronted by this that they vehemently reject it. Sometimes they'll cry, sometimes they'll get outraged and angry, and then all of a sudden it becomes all about them and their response to the accusation. Now, you coined this phrase, I think I'm right in saying, back in about 2011, and it certainly helped to put you and your thinking and writing into the popular sphere. The book was a huge success. Why has this concept, do you think, resonated so much with so many people? And have you been surprised by that?
Well, first, let me just add one piece to the way you described. You just basically defined white fragility, and yes, we fall apart and we get upset, and so we're fragile in that sense that it doesn't take very much. There will be people who, the very fact that we're saying white people, they're already upset. Okay, so it's fragile in that. But it's not fragile at all in its impact. It actually functions so beautifully and so powerfully to stop the conversation, right? To, you won't challenge me. I'm going to make it so punitive and miserable for you to challenge me that you won't do that again. And so it's a very powerful form of social control. That doesn't mean you're consciously, thinking, let's see, how do I control the situation? But, reactions are not benign. They have impacts. And so we have to start asking, so what's the impact of that reaction on a person who's trying to give me some feedback about something that I'm not aware that I'm doing? Wouldn't you want to know? That's a question I just keep wanting to ask white people. Wouldn't you want to know if you were on some level making a fool of yourself on the light end, and like I did at that dinner, and also hurting people like I also did at that dinner? Okay. So you asked me,
were you surprised by how it took off this term? Yeah.
Yes, actually, I wrote it. It was tucked away in some academic journal. I didn't think anybody read it. Maybe some graduate students somewhere. And then there was a racial conflict here in Seattle, and there were some op-eds written, and a Black man quoted extensively from the article, and it went viral, and it changed my life. um, and the feedback I started getting from around the world is that I had put language to something familiar. So for people of color, I had nailed it with that term, this thing. For, again, another book I want to recommend is Rennie Edo Lodge's book. She's British. She's a Black woman who has a book called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Racism.
Yes.
That's kind of like the other side of receiving white fragility. So I had given it language, and I had done it as an insider. And there was just a piece about that, and I want to be clear that I wasn't really saying anything Black people and other people of color hadn't been saying. But unfortunately, the nature of this is it had more weight when I said it. Now, I don't want to say it's completely because I'm white. That played a part, but that insider piece was really important too.
Yeah.
And so it spoke to people of color. It was like, thank you, white lady, for acknowledging and admitting to that and making space for other people to do it and calling in other people. But also white people who had been, oh my goodness, I've done that. And even though I'm being pretty direct with you when we're having this conversation, I appreciate that you acknowledge that I don't put myself outside of any of this.
Yeah.
So I was also pointing the finger inward, not just outward. And that also helped white people say, well, if she can admit that, and she's respected in this field, I can admit this too.
Yes. Well, more to the point, and I think some people have taken offence at this, you generalise about white people, and you write, it is okay to generalise about white people, and in doing so, you are rejecting this kind of sacred notion of individualism that many of us cling on to, that we can be separate from, say, the essentially white supremacist society that we are brought up in. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me just pause. You're an excellent interviewer. Thank you. Individualism is the narrative that each of us is unique and special and different, and we make it or we fail or succeed all completely on our own, that we're untouched by the social forces around us. And I think it's one of the foundational pillars that uphold this system, right? Because it allows white people to exempt themselves from the system. So let me be really clear. We are individuals. And I don't know anybody who's listening right now, and I don't know your stories or your experiences or your relationships. But we are also members of social groups that profoundly impact the trajectory and outcome of our lives. And we have to be willing to kind of set aside that, how special we are. We get plenty of emphasis there when we're in the dominant group, and move over to, okay, but what is the shared collective experience? And an example that I think is clearer for people is gender. When you are born and your legs are opened and they declare boy or girl, all the forces of socialization are set into play. The blanket you get wrapped in, the food you're given, we could go on and on. Everything is gendered. And there's just no denial that it shapes the trajectory of your life. And you can resist it. You can challenge it, but you have to resist it and you have to challenge it. You can't be exempt from it. And we understand that around gender, but somehow we think that race is different and we could be exempt from the collective experience of our racial assignment.
Yeah.
And so that's all I'm asking. Be willing to also, or any white person right now listening, thinking to themselves, okay, but I'm different from these things she's saying because I'm X, Y, and Z. I would say, okay, I would ask you to reflect on how has X, Y, and Z been shaped by the fact that you're white? How has your whiteness shaped how you experience X, Y, and Z? Because I confidently can assure you that if you were Black, your experience of X, Y, and Z would be different.
Yeah. I mean, your book's got me thinking about so many things, actually. So the idea that if white people are socialised into a deeply internalised sense of superiority that we can't bring ourselves to concede, and I have no problem with that idea, how does this play out in interracial friendships, interracial relationships and marriage, and the children that come out of these relationships? And I understand these relationships are a rapidly growing demographic in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, one of the strategies I would offer for white people who want to engage in this journey is to build authentic cross-racial relationships. So to have actual marriage type partnerships or intimate partnerships is a powerful introduction or interruption to how we've been socialized. So let me I'm going to go off on a little digression because you're just giving me the opportunity.
Sure.
I was not raised to know or love Black people. I wasn't raised to care about Black people. I wasn't raised to have relationships with Black people. I don't think most white people are. I think it's an exception. We go to separate schools, we live in separate neighborhoods, and so on, right? And so a part of challenging this is to build those relationships, but that is not going to free you. And I'm gonna call on gender again. I am a cisgender woman. And I'm going to call on gender not to exempt myself because I also experience sexism, but because sexism is such an easy way in for me, right? So I'm married, as systemic racism is the default, so is patriarchy. And I'm married to a man, and he loves me. And I don't know if any of the women in the audience can relate. All his conditioning under sexism didn't disappear as soon as he developed fond regard for me. And it comes up in our relationship. Assumptions he makes, things he says and do. My conditioning into sexism also comes up. So you want to always be working on it. And so when white women say, "Oh, I'm not racist, I'm married to a Black man," it's like, okay, that's great. But if you're sharing that in order to establish you're free of racism, I'm not so sure you're particularly conscious about how it works. And if you shared that immediately with no sensitivity to how that might land on a Black woman, for example, right? I don't want people to misunderstand that I'm saying you can't, if I was married to a Black man, I couldn't share it. But how, when, and why I'm sharing it, where I'm sharing it, what my agenda is when I share it, that's what we have to attend to.
Yeah.
It's a rich potential source of insight. So share it in those contexts. But if it's, can you imagine if at that dinner, we'll use that as an example, I immediately let them know, "Oh, I used to date a Black man. Yeah. So I'm not racist." Trust me, they would be rolling their eyes. If I did it like that, right? That would tell them, "Oh boy, this is not a very conscious white woman."
Yes. You remind us through the book how segregated racially our lives are as white people by and large. I wonder, are young white people in the States who've grown up in a world that's perhaps more diverse, perhaps in the inner city areas, in some cities in America, maybe in a more multicultural country, are they exhibiting less racism, less subconscious racism than their parents? Any signs of improvement, I suppose, is what I'm asking?
At the risk of discouraging the listeners, I would say no. It's a highly adaptive system. I mean, during the years that we had Barack Obama as president, my work was harder because so many white people said we're post-racial. I don't think anyone is in denial how not post-racial we are. Obama was followed by Trump. we could tolerate, we could have a black president, and we could now have Trump and have all of these laws and this, this backlash. So it's a highly adaptive system. So we can never be complacent. That doesn't mean we don't work continually to challenge it and change it, but we just can't kind of rest. We got voting rights legislation in the 60s in the US, and it's almost completely gone at this point, right? That's what happens when you get complacent. The forces that are invested in this system are powerful. And so what I notice in young white people today is they still live segregated lives. They just do. That is actually increasing, not decreasing. And so they may have a superficial ability to talk about these terms, or they may have a poster of, I'm not into sports, but a black basketball player, that they admire, but in their actual life, they don't have relationships across race. And then there's this culture of irony that is, I think about The Simpsons as a kind of a great example, right? I didn't grow up with The Simpsons, but my daughter grew up with The Simpsons, this TV show, right? That kind of, we can make fun of the Quickie Mart person who works there because we know we're making fun. So they often will tease their friends of color, and their friends of color have to laugh along. If they don't, then things don't go so well. Yeah. So the white young person thinks, see, this is cool, he doesn't mind, but I would have to ask, and if he did, would you be able to hold that?
Yeah. You focus attention on what we might call micro-transgressions, interpersonal harms that progressive white people are guilty of. But of course, structural racism is about, among other things, power. Does much change if we learn to interact in a more conscious way with black people and people of colour, if at the same time those structures of power are not changing?
Yeah.
And is there a relationship, I suppose, between those two concepts?
Yeah. I mean, institutions are not people, but people make up institutions. And there are many aspects of this. It plays out on many different levels. I tend to focus on the interpersonal, but my work in my book should never be all that you read, right? There's just so much out there. But I think about it two pieces. One, I can say as a result of doing this work that I do less harm than I used to. And less harm is not small. Less harm could be one more hour on somebody's life that they didn't have to take home that behavior like I did at the dinner party and endure it and lay awake all night frustrated by it, wondering whether it was worth it to call it in. All of those microaggressions that people of color hold and endure, because generally it gets worse when they try to talk to us, not better. That actually leads to higher rates of heart disease and blood pressure and different, literally you could predict how long people are going to live based on their racial assignment, and all of that adds to it. And so it matters. And when I do step in it as a result of doing this work, much less often, much less defensive, and I have very good repair skills. And that has built trusting relationships. The people of color in my life have told me, we don't expect you to be free of all your conditioning. It's like I don't expect my husband to be free of all his conditioning. But there's some things I want to see. And if I see those things, then I'm going to trust him, right? We're going to be trusted. But a part of being what we might now be calling an ally is you're also working to change those structures. Yeah, it makes a difference, but it's not enough. And there I take notes while you're asking me questions because there's so many good parts to them. one thing I wanted to say about young people is white nationalism is absolutely on the rise, and young people, young white people, are absolutely who they are targeting, and it is growing among young white people. So we need to pay attention to that too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was interested with what you said before about it being illegal in some jurisdictions to point out some of the stuff that you're talking about today, and this quite strange backlash against critical race theory too that's going on in America at the moment, which was essentially a fairly marginal, narrow area of scholarship that all of a sudden has become everything kind of evil in American society, according to some legislators. It's quite a strange and profound backlash, isn't it?
It is. Carol Anderson wrote White Rage, and she's a Black academic who argues that every inch of Black progress has been met with a backlash of white rage. And in a way, it's like white fragility at the structural level, right? And that's what we're seeing. We saw this incredible global moment of Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020. You were probably impacted by the murder of George Floyd, right? Yep. And by the millions, white people were getting involved. And now you see what we have, this backlash against so-called critical race theory. So while true critical race theory is a narrow area of scholarship within legal studies, it's being used as a stand-in basically for anything that acknowledges that racism is real. Yeah. And certainly anything that acknowledges what I'm saying. So while I'm not technically a critical race theorist, I'm absolutely one of the people on the top of that list. Because it's just a stand-in. And this is important too, because when we talk about loss, what does it cost white people? We have consistently been able to be manipulated by stimulating racial animus. It's just worked for so long for politicians, and it just continues to work. It's like we're puppets, right? Just bring it up and we react to it. And then we are able to tolerate policies that are harmful to everybody. I mean, we would have universal health care in the U.S. If they didn't keep saying, you don't want those undeserving welfare mothers in the ghetto to have free health care, do you? So, and no, we don't. Okay. So now nobody has it.
Yeah. Going to take some questions in about 5 minutes. So if you're a progressive white person in the audience who wants to fire away at Robin, perhaps move toward the microphone. I'll give the usual warning that I give at all of these sessions, to keep the questions brief and for the questions not to be masqueraded as short speeches. Your books, White Fragility and Nice Racism, Robin, have drawn a lot of praise, but of course you don't write provocative books like this without also receiving some criticism. Some of it highly personal, I might say. Some of the criticism too has come from Black people. John McWhorter is a high-profile person who's commented, professor at Columbia Uni, who called White Fragility a racist tract that diminished Black people in the name of dignifying us. There have been others who seem to suggest that as a white person you're condescending. I just thought I'd give you the opportunity to respond to that. What do you say to people who are critical of your work?
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think what I'd like to ask John McWhorter is, what is your history of anti-racist activism, right? So talk to me about that, because in the article that you're referring to in The Atlantic, this came out in the summer of 2020, and as a Black man, John McWhorter stated in that article that he has rarely ever experienced racism. And that in fact, it's been an advantage to be Black. And I wouldn't wish him anything else, but I don't believe he speaks for most Black people. He is a very conservative Black man. Ben Carson, Candace Owens, the Supreme Court. I don't know why my mind is going blank on our Supreme Court. Do you know?
Clarence Thomas.
Clarence Thomas, excuse me. Right. I mean, conservative Black people exist. Their voices are amplified by white people who are invested in that message. You know, it's very useful. But the Black people that I respect uphold my work, right? So, okay, John McWhorter said it wasn't useful or relevant. Michael Eric Dyson, Ibram X. Kendi, Candace Owens, Beverly Tatum, Carol Anderson do find it really, really useful. So, you know, it's much too charged for it to not be controversial for some people.
Yeah. Look, I'd love to take some questions from the audience. If someone would like to step up to the microphone, we'd love to take your questions. I think we have some people moving toward the microphone now. Maybe we can throw forward to one of our attendees here at the festival. Are we ready to go? Great, welcome.
Hello. As a young, I guess, Asian person, I've often been met with nice racism and white fragility, as what you may say. And every time I'm met with that, my brain kind of pauses and I'm thinking, how am I supposed to respond to this? Do I get angry? Do I educate them kind of firmly? Or should I be gentle with them like I would a toddler, in a way? And I just wanted to ask, how did you come to become more self-reflective? And in those types of situations, what is the best way for me to respond?
Thank you so much. And I mean, I hope all the white people heard that, heard that unlike John McWhorter, I have spoken to her experience. But also, please, this is one of the things nice white people do, is they don't approach her when this is over and lecture her or put her on the spot to share more about her experience. You know, you have a range of options. Yeah, I want to be a little sensitive to the fact that as a white person, it feels a little off to tell you how to navigate us. You know, you're going to have to go with, in that moment, what feels safest to you or most effective to you. And actually not saying anything is an empowered choice. You don't have to give it away, if you will. You don't have to do that work if you choose not to. And I just say that because I know sometimes people of color go home and think, oh, I didn't speak up or I sold out. Rather than think about it that way, there's a phrase, I'm not religious, but there's a phrase you may be familiar with from the Bible, which is, you don't have to throw your pearls in front of somebody who might step on them. So if your sense is that it wouldn't go well, then protect yourself. On the other hand, you might want to say something. And so in some ways, you're just going to have to read that person and think about what would be the most strategic response. And that's assuming that you're calm, right? If you're not calm and you're upset, then and you want to express it. And what I would say to white people is, let go of how people of color let you know you've hurt them. Don't put all these rules on them. You have to tell me calmly and you can't be upset. No, they're challenging you across a line of power and across a deep history of harm. You might see yourself as a white person. God, I just said that one thing, and it's just me, Robin, and you should know I'm nice, but I have to understand that I represent every other nice white Robin that this person has ever interacted with. So one last strategy to the person who asked that question is, you could ask a nice white person who claims to be an ally, ask them to take on that person. If it happens, say, in the workplace, if you think that maybe they'd be more receptive to another white person, or feel like it would help them save face so they may not lash out. ask your friend, hey, especially if your friend was there and also heard it, you know, and the last thing is that it's okay not to really know what to do in the moment, and sit with it and process it and work through it. And then if you decide to come back when you're calm, when you feel more grounded, less maybe flooded if it was upsetting. And sometimes an approach like, hey, we were talking the other day, you said this thing and it sounded like you meant this, or it really landed on me like this. Is that what you meant? Right? So you're naming it, but you're doing it in a way that gives them some space, and that hopefully will decrease defensiveness. Sometimes you might just want to say, that's racist. And go for it. Just know that unfortunately we don't always respond that well, but if that's what you want to say, you say it.
Okay, our next questioner.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this wonderful exploration of this issue. I'm interested in law enforcement agencies. Here in Australia we have deaths in custody. I'm from a small town in central Victoria where a woman was taken off a train and locked up. She was intoxicated and she died in custody, one of many of our Indigenous people to do so. And in the United States we see on the news police enforcement, quite violent police enforcement against African Americans and their fear and terror of the police, many cases there. What can be done to help our law enforcement agencies to deal with this, which is a form of your white fragility, our white fragility?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. And just it's heartbreaking, and it is the reality. And whereas for so long we've said that's just some bad apples, I'm going to say no. It's a system and a structure that allows for that lack of accountability. If you think about George Floyd, Officer Chauvin is the one who had his knee on his neck, but he couldn't have pulled that, what I would say is an execution off, without the participation of 4 other officers. And if he didn't, at a deep level, assume there would be no consequences. So I think we have made progress in the sense that we have gotten some rulings that I just don't believe we would have ever gotten before the Black Lives Matter movement. It does make a difference. It's long and it's hard and it has to be sustained. The specifics within police, it's not my area, but I know there are some really good books and consultants out there that do focus on specific strategies within that. But we just have to keep speaking up and showing up. We can see the power that powerful people have when they show up at school board meetings. Let's be those powerful people showing up at whatever form would give voice to your concerns to the police department. We just have to make it harder for them to assume that they won't have to answer for it.
Okay, another question.
Hi, Robin. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. I'm from the UK and I deliver anti-racist workshops and trainings, and we do reference your work. And I often find that there's sometimes a bit of tension, because I find myself, as a person of colour, delivering these workshops to mainly white people. And I find that once I start talking about white fragility, everyone goes silent, and suddenly no one wants to talk, no one wants to discuss anything with me, because they're afraid of being seen as fragile. And I find that frustrating, because I want to have those conversations and I want to gather what people are thinking. And I just wondered whether you had any advice on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And unfortunately, the camera's not on the speaker, so I appreciate you identifying yourself as a person of color. I couldn't see you, and that impacts the way that I would answer really any question is what is the position of the person asking that question, and my position in relation to them. I mean, unfortunately, the reality is that it can help to lead these kinds of trainings in a interracial team. That really is ideal. We don't always have that ability, but if you could, then there are certain things that the white facilitator can name or call in differently than perhaps you could, right? So first, I want to just give a little bit of my thinking about silence. I think that's, well, yes, people are afraid or nervous. They might say the wrong thing. The irony is, how will you find out that thing you were thinking or about to say is the wrong thing if you weren't willing to show yourself and take that risk? And silence from a position of power is actually a power move. So I want to pause with that. Silence from a position of power functions as a power move. So you as a person of color put something out there, particularly if you put something vulnerable out there, and you're met with silence from a group, you don't know where they're coming from. And that's what you just said. I want to know how people are hearing this. And for me, I know that if I was challenging a group of men about patriarchy and I was met with silence, my assumption would not be that they were supportive. My assumption would be that they were feeling some hostility to the conversation. So I think white people need to understand that. Like, even if you're scared, just say that. I'm nervous. I wrote an article called "Nothing to Add: The Role of White Silence in Cross-Racial Discussions." And sometimes when I have that dynamic, I actually assign that article for them to read. But a woman of color and I I used to co-facilitate with, came with this list called silence breakers. We took all the reasons that we heard from our students about why they didn't say anything, and we came up with a list of how they could have prefaced what they were thinking in a way that would open the conversation and help them. So, for example, I'm really nervous about saying this, and I'm worried I might offend somebody. So please, I invite you to let me know if I do. But here's what I'm thinking. Am I missing anything? That would be one example. I just felt something shift in the room. I'm not sure what it was, but I'm wondering if anybody else felt that. It's just this list of ways people can enter the conversation and passing it around in small groups, maybe lighten it up. What's the worst thing that could happen if you said the wrong thing in good faith? And you can actually download that particular handout from my website.
Yeah. Thanks, Robin. Look, I'd love to continue this conversation, but I think we're going to have to bring it to an end. Yes, the Adelaide Writers' Week volunteer is pointing to her wristwatch. So unfortunately, I'm sorry to those who didn't get a chance to ask the question. This has been such a stimulating session. The book is incredibly instructive and thought-provoking for those of us who maybe were deluded into thinking that we didn't have much to answer for ourselves. I do commend it to you. Clearly, Robin is not going to be at the desk signing books, although we really wish that she could be here to sign the book, but her books are available, I'm sure, from the bookstore. Robin, can I thank you very much for joining us today at Adelaide Writers' Week. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming along.